Welcome to IVF This, episode 100, Our Journey, an interview with my husband. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. After 10 years of primary and secondary infertility due to both male and female factor infertility, I am now the mother to 3 beautiful miracles. I am married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you how to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I am so excited to bring this episode to you today because I've had a lot of people over the course of the last few years ask me about my personal journey, but more importantly, what it was like for our marriage. I've talked a little bit about it, but you are going to get to hear it from Dr. Ginn himself today. I want everyone to meet my beautiful, amazing, brilliant husband, Dr. Vance Ginn. Hi, honey.
Hello. It's good to be with you.
I told you when we first launched this that I was going to save you for episode 100, and I keep my promises. Aren't you so lucky?
Yes, I am in many ways.
Don't turn on the charm full blast yet. We got an interview to get through.
Fine.
All right. Okay. So the purpose of this particular interview is really just to get your side of our 10 years of infertility. I talk about my experience. I talk a lot about the experiences of my clients, but you're actually the first man that we've had on the podcast to talk about their personal experience. We can kick it off wherever you want. I think it would probably be easiest to start with when we first started back in the spring of 2012, pretty much when we decided to get off birth control. And it wasn't necessarily an active trying from what I remember, but more of a, we're not going to stop it if we get pregnant. But I want to hear from you. So let's take it all the way back 10 years.
Yeah, it's wild that it's been that long now, to think that It's been a decade since we got all this stuff started. Going back then, I mean, we didn't know that it would be all of the hoops and hurdles that we would have. I mean, I think we just thought, all right, let's stop this, and then you'll get pregnant. We'll be pregnant and ready to go. But then we had some other things that we had to go through and different issues to have to see. And I mean, we've grown so much over the last decade. It's almost kind of hard to think about exactly where it all started. But from what I remember was that early on, we were just so excited about having kids and growing our family, besides just the 2 cats, that we would really see this happen and hopefully pretty quickly. When that didn't happen on our timeline, it became frustrating, worrisome, nervous about the next steps, and really draining, I think, on each of us, but also our relationship, on our work, and just a lot of trying times over that period.
I love how you mentioned our time, because you're 100% correct. We had no way of knowing that it would take the time and effort that it took, but we certainly grew. I know I grew. I won't speak for you, but I know I grew really frustrated around the 6-month-ish mark. That would have been around Christmas time. I think that was the year I actually had a pretty intense foot surgery. I had injured my foot. I was all woe is me. I was throwing a pity party every other hour. But I remember really growing frustrated around the 6-month mark. What do you feel like was your boiling point or a particular frustration point?
During that time, I was also working on my PhD and working on my dissertation, looking for jobs and trying to figure out, okay, what's going to be the next step. So there were just a lot of stress that was going on in both of our lives. And then again, like our lives together, that there did seem to be like this ongoing, okay, what's next? How are we going to get across this? And with so many questions, see all the question marks going up, that it's like, okay, what are we going to do now? How do we overcome this issue with infertility where it seems so much out of your control that all these other things to some extent we can control. I can control how much I work on my dissertation and in my dissertation for economics, and then you can kind of control what's going on with your foot. But this seemed like something that we just couldn't control, which made it even more of a burden, more of a stress that was put on us.
Oh, for sure. So we tried on our own before seeking out doctor's help or anything for about, I'd say like 14 or 15 months, because in the summer of 2013, you had just finished your PhD in May of 2013. And so he was on the job market. We were trying to figure out if we were going to stay in Houston, where we lived at the time. But your ultimate goal was to get to Austin and work for a foundation that you ended up working for. But it was still, there was so much in flux during that time. And that was also around the time that we met with our first reproductive endocrinologist in Houston. One of the first things that we did was a semen analysis, because that's the easiest, it's the most cost-effective first line of testing for any potential infertility. And that was when we discovered that there was some motility issues, because you have a very high tolerance for my particular brand of humor. I always say that your guys were just kind of standing around looking at each other. But then on the heels of that, then we also discovered that I had a very large cyst on my left ovary. And so we were balancing all of this stuff. So tell me a little bit about what you remember feeling or experiencing when we got the news about your semen analysis. And then it wasn't like, hey, we don't have just one thing to look at, we have two things now.
I mean, that was something that I initially didn't even think about at all. I was more like, well, I guess this is something going on with you, honestly, that it was something going on with you about being infertile somehow, that I didn't really think about the semen and motility and mobility and all these other factors that could be at play. When we started finding out more of those things, it also opened my eyes like, okay, we are really in this together, that it takes both sides to be able to work on this. And there's a lot of other things to consider when you're going through the process. I mean, I think it also helped it to hit home a little bit more of, all right, this is us. But at the same time, it was also like, dang, it's also me. So there was the stress, there was the doubt, the pressure on me to say, okay, what's going on? How can I fix this? As you know, right, I'm always looking at solutions. That's what I do with work and everything else, but even at home. So then I'm like, okay, what's the next step? Let's get to this. I think that's when we might have tried like IUI and some other things along the way, but it felt more of the burden, like the stress, the monkey was on my back a lot to figure out, how do I really set the stage? How do I really help us to have a kid? So it was stressful. It was, sad. And at the time,
I mean, we have to also remember that was the point at which, when they found the large mass on my ovary, I also experienced an ovarian torsion shortly after that, which required surgery. And then we did get the move to Austin. We've completed that. And then we found out from the OBGYN that we established care here with that we were going to have to remove that ovary. It was never going to not produce that very large cyst. So I'm curious, from your perspective, watching me go through two almost back-to-back surgeries. One was in September, one was in November. And then almost immediately on the heels of that, we did get pregnant spontaneously.
It was a tough time because I saw you go through a lot of pain, stress. I remember us talking about it, that at least there were some steps that maybe we could take to having the child, that maybe this was what was one of the major issues, or an issue that was holding us back. If we could get this out of the way, then that would allow us that opportunity to have a kid. I was nervous and stressed and worried about you and your health and everything else. But I think there was also a little bit of excitement that, okay, maybe once we get past all this, that we can have this kid that we've been trying for a long time. And, it was quite remarkable, maybe even miraculous, some would say, that after you had that second surgery, I mean, it was pretty quick to where you got pregnant spontaneously, after that.
Yeah, it was actually the very next cycle. It was very quickly. So we're going to fast forward a year. We now have our oldest son, and we are contemplating trying again. At least from my perspective, I knew we already had some lingering doubts as to whether or not we would be able to do this as quickly and quote unquote easily as last time. So I was kind of mentally prepared for the conversation about, hey, we might want to look at some sort of medical intervention, timed intercourse, medicated cycles, IUIs, whatever. And we tried just traditional sex for about 6 months. And then we started moving into IUIs. We did 4 nearly back-to-back IUI cycles. But what I'm really curious on, and I think would be really important for you to share, there was a difference for you, at least in our conversations, what I understood, a difference from you when we were trying spontaneously and IUIs versus IVF on a really like spiritual, moral kind of juxtaposition. So I'd be really interested to know what your thoughts are from where we were trying spontaneously with maybe some medicated cycles versus going full bore into IVF.
Yeah, I mean, you're really jogging my memory about some of this stuff. maybe I repressed it for a while. There was a lot of tough times for me, not only as we're going through all this. I mean, the cost starts to go up, and as an economist and I always think about trade-offs. And so for each dollar that we're doing for this, we're not doing for this other thing. And it was also at a time when we didn't have much money then either. This was as we were getting started with our careers. And so there was all that stress. But then there was additional stress that I had from more of the spiritual angle of, does this mean that God doesn't want us to have any kids? Or does this mean that, and later on, does God not want us to have more kids? I really struggled with that. Because in my mind, right, it was more about the spontaneity, quote unquote, the natural way of having sex to have kids was the route to go. And so if you're doing something else, is that really changing the direction of your life, of where things were going to go? And it does, of course, but is there a path already that God had planned for you? There was a lot of battles that we talked about and went through. And I mean, honestly, I struggled with it a lot at the time, and even under subsequent IVF issues that we've went through and our cycles that we've went through about it as well. But I think some of the things that helped me was looking at it from a biblical perspective. Was God said for us to be fruitful and multiply. I mean, that was one of the first commandments in Genesis. If you think about what we were set out to do as humans, was part of that. And that always came back to my mind, that we should be fruitful and multiply. And God also gave us brains in order to come up with science and new technologies and things of that nature that allow us the opportunity to fulfill that ultimate mission in our lives. And we felt so strongly that God was pushing us in a direction to have kids. And we felt it ourselves, that we really wanted to have kids, that was going to be, in many ways, one of the only ways that it was going to happen. And if that was the way that it was going to happen through science and these new technologies and everything else to fulfill that goal, then let's do it. Let's move forward. But it was a struggle that I stayed awake with at night. And, we talked about and maybe even had some little, arguments along the way about it. But I think that it helped us also grow and feed into, okay, who we are as people, who we are as a couple, who we are as humans in general. And it really set us the stage for us to be even better people and parents and along like we are now.
I think you're being very generous with just using the term arguments. I remember very heated discussions.
Yeah.
Because I really never struggled with the morality. My stance was always, we would never have this conversation if I was diagnosed with cancer and whether or not to do chemotherapy. So that wasn't anything to do with me. Just because I never struggled with it, it doesn't mean that your struggle wasn't important, because that was such an integral part of your experience with IVF. Was, you really, something that I remember you struggling with a lot, or at least talking to me a lot about, is like, well, what happens if down the road one of these beautiful blessings is taken from us? Does that mean that that's like a punishment for pursuing something outside of, from your vantage point, from what God wanted from us? I just remember just holding so much compassion for you as you really, really struggled with what is the right thing to do in this situation.
Yeah.
Please know, everyone listening, this wasn't about him not wanting kids. He absolutely wanted kiddos. It was just the route really caused a lot of hesitation. You referenced Genesis and some other things, but I can clearly remember us sitting in the banker's office on a cold October morning or something, Saturday morning, and we were signing over for a check of $20,000 to do our very first IVF round. And you looked me dead ass in the eyes and you said, this better work. Outside of student loans, neither of us had taken out any kind of money like that, outside of a house and student loans, I should say. You mentioned money earlier, and for anyone who hasn't heard our story, we paid out of pocket for all of our cycles. We've had 2 full IVF cycles and 3 frozen embryo transfers. So all of that totaled for us is about $70-ish thousand. That's how much money we have in kids. So I'm curious, what else did you experience as you were kind of coming around to taking this massive leap of faith?
The other big thing was thinking like an economist, like I do, are the trade-offs, right? Again, where the trade-off of us not doing this was that we wouldn't have kids. In some sense, there is a return on investment. So what's going to be the benefit of the kids over time compared to the cost of the dollars we have today, that we're going to forgo some things, but those things that we're going to forgo aren't going to be nearly as great as the kids that we could potentially have. At the end of the day, that was another big part of saying, you know what, this is the right thing to do. We've just got to do it, because we can have all the material things that we want, but material things don't make you who you are. They don't necessarily improve who you are as a person. Whereas if we have kids, we're instilling in them a set of values, but they're also bringing joy to us along the way. That really started to highlight to me of how much I wanted kids and how much I wanted kids with you. If it doesn't work, then all right, we'll take the loss and we'll keep going. But if it does work, we have this beautiful opportunity to bring another human being in the world and help him or her to grow and do all those things. So it was extraordinary opportunity that we couldn't pass up.
Oh, I love it so much. Okay.
You know, you're going to get some economics along the way.
And I want everyone to hear me when I say this. This is how my life is lived. This is exactly what it's like to live with Dr. Vance Ginn. 100% of the time, these are the conversations we have about groceries, not just IVF, okay?
Everyone should be so lucky, just like I'm lucky with you.
As well they should. Oh, I love you. Our first IVF transfer was successful. We had our now 5-year-old. And then we waited about 3 years. There was a move to Virginia and back for us. And then in the late-ish summer of 2020, we did what would be our second frozen embryo transfer, trying for our third child. I know for me, I walked into that almost skipping without kind of a doubt in my mind that it would be successful. Like, it didn't even occur to me as much as I know about IVF. And at that point I had already been coaching around infertility and stuff like that. So, what were your thoughts going into that transfer?
Since we had planned so much to have that child and for it all to work, I'm always a little bit more reserved than you, in the sense of I was like, okay, this may not work. And so I don't want to get my hopes up too much. It's probably a form of conditioning that I've had throughout my life. But there was this idea that maybe it wouldn't work, but I'm excited about it. I mean, we had a name picked out. I mean, there was a lot of things that was already heading into that, where the baby was already here.
It was a done deal.
It was a done deal. Yeah. And so there was a lot of anticipation that this was going to work. But I still had some of those reservations in my mind of, what happens if it doesn't work? I don't want to set myself up too high, because then if I'm that high, then I've got a long way to fall down. There were some coping skills that I was trying to use at the moment. I was stressed about it. Let's put it that way.
And then we got the call that it didn't work. And, I'm feeling very emotional just thinking about it. You had to hold the phone because I couldn't continue. I'm so, man.
Yeah, it was a tough time.
I couldn't even continue the conversation with our nurse's aide or nursing assistant or medical assistant because I fell to the floor. And I remember you pacing. You're a really big pacer when you think and when you talk.
Yeah.
And then that really set us, because that was September 11th of 2020 was when we got that call, the I'm so sorry to tell you call.
Yeah.
And I just remember that was some of the darkest times of our marriage. And we had already been through quite a bit. While I gather myself, tell us a little bit about what your experience was of that initial shock and then your grieving process through the next several months.
It was tough, given the buildup like we just talked about of how much that we wanted this child, and we already had one and it worked. Actually, we had two, right? We had our oldest, and then we had one through the IVF cycle. We had this one embryo left over, remaining, I should say. And it's like, okay, this is going to be our third child. You know, it was going to be 3 kids. With all of that anticipation and everything else, to get that call with the expectation that she's going to say, yes, you're pregnant, the implant worked, whatever they say.
Congratulations or whatever.
And then when that wasn't the case, it was a huge shock. I mean, I was just like, well, are you sure? Is there anything else that we can do? Not only was I concerned about myself, but I was also really concerned about you, because I knew that in your mind, it was a done deal, whereas probably I was a little bit more reserved out of it. And so I also knew that it was going to hit you hard, which it did, and rightfully so. With all of that, there was just a lot of emotions that was going on, where I remember we just held each other for a long time because we both happened to be at home together. The kids weren't there, daycare or somewhere else. So we were able to just have that moment together. But it really felt like a loss. It was like there was a huge loss within us after losing my dad in 2011, kind of suddenly this year, lost my mom. There was a loss at that time too, where that was something we had anticipated. That was already a being within our family that was going to be here. And so it took a hit, I think, for both of us as we grieved through that process.
It kind of cascaded for us. And I know for me that I felt so lost. I could not conceptualize why we would get to this point and it wouldn't work. And I know that that is a very common struggle, because for IVF, your inputs don't equal your outputs all the time. We worked really hard for this baby, and it never happened. It never materialized. I never got pregnant. That was in September, and we actually started couples counseling. It was getting really dicey for us, kind of in our separate grief experiences. I will take a lot of ownership over the diciness. Emily made some not great team-based decisions in my grief. And so we started seeing a counselor. And one of the things that we decided in that fall time was that we weren't going to talk about doing another IVF cycle until after the new year. So that would have been after the new year of 2021, because I was almost immediately saying I wanted to go into another cycle. And you were like, what the hell are you talking about? We only ever said we were going to do one. So I definitely changed the game on you. So curious about your thoughts on that.
I could definitely tell. I mean, not only from what you're telling me, but kind of your actions. Usually, whatever you're thinking is usually worn on your face pretty well. Right? With your expressions. And so I knew that in your mind, you were already ready to go. But then I think there were certain things that kind of started to hold me back. I mean, part of it was the spiritual stuff started coming up again about, is this really the right next step? Did we lose the child because this wasn't the next step for us? That this is the size of our family now is 4, that we don't need to go do anything else. Like, we're done. This is great. I honestly felt complete at that moment. That with just our 4. Whereas I knew that you didn't feel complete. Like, you had talked about having 3 kids for a while. And when we first got together, you didn't want kids at one time. But at that point, you really had this idea and you had a dream. I mean, there was a kind of a spiritual connection, I think, that you felt that you had with the 3 kids. That was all going on. And there was a bigger tie to you. And I mean, I think part of it too is that you had just went through all of the IVF shots, the hormones and everything else that's going on. There is a difference between the female going through the IVF and the male not. Even though we're in it together, there are differences because you have a bigger connection with each and every day. Those actions that you're taking is building you up to having that baby I'm not experiencing. And so there was a more of an attachment in that sense as well that I just didn't have. At that moment, I'm like, all right, well, I don't want to do this again. Let's think about it later. But I think over the next few months after it didn't work, for one thing, I went back to the idea of the spiritual part, how God wants us to be fruitful and multiply. And if this is going to be us and this is where we should be, then let's do it again. At the same time, I think that we were doing better financially. So that started to speed things up. And so that helped. But also I could tell of how much it was hurting you. And I didn't want you to be hurting then or in the future and having these like what ifs come up that we may have had a regret of not doing that in the future. And we were getting older and so there could be only a certain amount of time for this all to work. A combination of all of these things got me in the idea and the mindset more of, you know what, this is the right thing to do. I really want another child as well. Let's go for it.
I distinctly remember we were driving in the car and we were just chatting. I think we were maybe picking up the kids at school or something. And you said, I'm kind of getting excited about the idea of having another kid. And at that point, we hadn't even decided about doing another cycle of IVF. Like, I really turned inside myself when I was grieving. And so a lot of my work before doing IVF again was about falling in love with the family that we had. And I have you to thank for that. I'm the one who will barrel headfirst into anything. Like, I'm the one I will make a split second decision, and we are just balls to the wall going for it. And you are much more measured. You're much more contemplative. You're much more thoughtful. I think we're both very thoughtful people, but you think several steps ahead, where I'm like, this is what's in front of me. I'm going to make the decision. That really allowed me the opportunity to genuinely stop and think and make sure that I wasn't trying to fill a hole. And because that wouldn't be fair to that little baby. That's not their job. It's not to fill a hole. It's to be their own person. And so I definitely have you to thank for that. We had made the decision to not even talk about it until after the new year. Well, we didn't even make a decision until March. When we say that we took time to really understand and really get to the root of what we were doing and why we were doing it and the importance of it, I mean, we took our sweet ass time. We also had been lucky enough, I say this very poised, I'm trying to be gentle with my language. A family member of yours had passed away, and we weren't aware that we were going to get any money from it, and we did. And that money actually went towards that last round of IVF. So in that sense, we were lucky. Obviously, we didn't want your family member to pass. And then we went through that second round in May of 2021, and we went through a full stimulation cycle. We ended up with day 5 blastocysts that were sent off for testing. And we got one back. Well, it was just one, and it was a little girl. You and I had joked for a long time that we could only grow boys, because that was historically the only gender we could grow.
Yeah.
We did the transfer in late July of 2021. And we actually found out that our transfer was successful on it would have been our 10-year anniversary. On or the day before, it was something like that. Then started actually a really, really tough pregnancy for me. I was sick pretty much the entire time. It was not a great moment in my history. And then this beautiful baby girl comes. And while we're awash with all of the feel goods, but also extremely tired, you lose your mom. She passed away after a pretty severe short illness. Kind of for your closing thoughts, we've been talking a lot about this idea of that trade-off between your mom and our baby. I think it would be interesting to hear your side and your perspective of that door closed for us, and we also suffered that loss. So it was beauty and wretchedness all at the same time. So tell us a little bit about that.
It was a lot, right? Because going back, I guess, to that failed transfer, that grieving process, and then having us starting the IVF process again with all of that. And then because your health wasn't the best even during that time either. And then we found out that the transfer worked, and that you're pregnant. And then, like you said, then that was also kind of a struggle. And in those last few months before we had the baby, you also weren't feeling well at that time. And so there was a lot of health issues and dealing with the other kids that we have, and work and everything else. There was a lot of things going on at one time. And so there was like this moment whenever we had the new baby where it's like, it was this beautiful time where things were looking up and everything else. And oh, by the way, at that same time, I think maybe 6 weeks before that, that's when my mom had went in the hospital, and we found out that she may not have much time to live. And so there were all these things that were happening very close around the same time. And so then the baby comes, then I find myself driving to Houston, where my mom was in the hospital, and going back and forth, and kind of leaving you at home with the babies and all the kids as a new mom and everything else, which was tough. And so a lot of times I was going, 3 hours there, 3 hours back within the same day, just so I could spend time with mom while at the same time being back home. And so that was all stressful, and work was going on, and maybe not going as well as I would normally have liked, but I also had a lot of life situations that were going on. It was one of the most tumultuous times of my life, of going through all these different emotions: grief, sadness, joy. I mean, it was all at one time, like, boom, here it is. With losing my mom soon after, I mean, it was 3 weeks to the day, almost at the exact same time that the baby was born. it brought together a lot of stuff. There was the day before that where you had actually seen some sort of image, like a light that was on the baby monitor that was going back and forth for the baby's swing. Anyway, we decided to take the baby to go see mom. And then that was the day that she passed, right before we had went in. And after that time, for a while, I did think about it as kind of a trade-off in some ways, where maybe this was what I had to give up in order to get, and kind of looked at it that way for a while, which kind of, I think, held me back in a way. But I think it was also almost a natural coping mechanism to some extent because of that grief and everything else that had been going on, and the loss of a mom who I was really close with. And, it's still a struggle that I'm going through it now, as our first holidays going through without mom being here is going to be tough. But then, it's been pretty recent, just in the last month or so, where I kind of had a different view on it. One day I was feeding the baby her purees and saying, hey, really getting along with her more, especially after the colic and everything else. That's always a tough time. And I don't usually like babies much until about 6 months anyway. And so we started to connect more. And I don't know, I just had like this thought in my head. I was like, man, I've been thinking about this all wrong. I have the baby now so that I could let mom go.
Yeah.
And so that helped to change the dynamic a lot, because I didn't want mom to go, but now I have a beautiful baby girl that is here and that I get to spend time with and see grow. And look back where I didn't have any regrets with mom. I had all these questions about things, but I also know like how sick that she was and everything else that she was going through at the time. She wasn't in a good state. I believe that she's in a better place in heaven and that she gets that opportunity. But now I get a baby girl who gets to experience the world with us, kind of our heaven that we have here. I didn't need to spend so much time giving that trade-off so much of my mind, because it was weighing on me and burdening me from having those moments and that joy with the baby and the family that we have now. I can't get mom back. And so I had to kind of step forward and say, you know what, this is the best thing for our family, and really come, not to grips, I wouldn't put it that way, but just to come to realization that this is an awesome situation we have now. And now we have an amazing family, and it's going to continue to grow and to prosper, let people prosper, as I like to say.
Oh, I love you in your heart so much, honey.
I love you.
And if anyone can hear, I do have a very whiny cat in the background, so I apologize. So really quick, I just want to see what would you have to offer to the husbands, to the male partners watching their wife, their partner, their best friend, their lover, going through all of the grieving that's associated, all of the shame that's associated, whether it's male factor infertility, female factor infertility, unknown. What would you impart to the guys, to the dudes in the groom who just want to be there, but not sure how?
I think it's something I'm still learning, that it's a learning process. The key thing would be is that there's no one right way, and you can't beat yourself up over it. Is that everybody grieves in a different way. From the books that I've read and from going through some major grieving things throughout my life, there's no one way to do it. You just have to go through it, but have someone you can talk to. Like, be sure that you're talking with your significant other, with your spouse, and making sure that there is an open dialogue, because you don't want to just be in your own head. Because then if you're on your own head having these conversations, then no one else is going to know what you're feeling. And then there's no way for them to help you. You may want them to help you, but if you're not talking to them, then there's no way that they can help you. So I think between having an open dialogue, knowing that there's not just one right way, I think really helped me a lot. And it is one thing that I hope would help others in the process. The other thing is now that I'm on the other side of it, I also am careful about what I tell other people of how to go through it, because it is so different for everyone that you don't want to just say one thing, because a lot of times people will think, well, you're just placating me or something else, and you're not really getting at the emotional part of it all, because it is a trying time. The infertility issue is a trying time. The fertility issue can be a trying time. The baby, when they get here, is a trying time. The kids, as they get older, but we learn. And I think we learn a lot through our mistakes and failures along the way. I think it's one of the important things that unfortunately we have to go through, but it is important for us to be able to learn from and hopefully learn from others. This is why I think it's such a great thing that you're doing with this podcast and having the opportunity to be here with you after watching all of your other episodes so often. I think it's a great thing that I hope others are continuing to get more insights from it. And one day our kids are going to listen to these and they'll have some good insights along the way as well, which kind of is a beautiful moment. It comes kind of full circle about like where we started with those struggles, but also the things that we're going to leave a legacy for the future of how things could improve and how our family is going to bond and grow and be such a better situation into the future.
I love you so much. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for being on the podcast, episode 100, kind of a landmark episode for IVF This. And I couldn't have imagined spending another 45 minutes anywhere else. So thank you. I love you. And yes, guys, he's actually recording in our bedroom. I am in our office. We are literally in the same house just to deliver this episode to you. So I love you, honey. Thank you very much.
I love you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found something to take from it. And if nothing else, just be really, really gentle with each other, knowing that you're going through some really, really challenging times. And the experience will be different from both of you. But understanding doesn't mean that you can't love and have compassion for the other person. So have a wonderful week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard and want to learn more, head over to ivfthiscoaching.com. That's www.ivfthiscoaching.com.